Well, South African telecoms operator Vodacom reported that its half-year headline earnings fell 9.5%, impacted by startup losses in Ethiopia and higher finance costs. Vodacom said it implemented a new simplified dividend policy, which is set at least 75% of Vodacom Group headline earnings, and declared an interim dividend of 340 cents per share. To talk to us a little bit more about the period that was, we are joined by Shamil Chisub, who is the CEO of Vodacom. Shamil, thank you so much for your time. As I mentioned to the audience and the viewers, let's look back at the 6 months that was for Vodacom. How would you describe that?
Well, I think resilient in terms of growth, a 7.7% increase in revenue growth. So I think that was hugely positive. Also an acceleration into the second quarter. So just over 10% growth in the second quarter. So very, very strong in that regard. I think that's encouraging on the one side, but also a period that we had to take a number of once-off costs that have come into play, especially around energy and energy costs that are coming through. Not necessarily once-off, but we started to invest quite heavily last year in the second quarter into energy to help create the resilience on our network. We're seeing it come through in network performance, where we're outpacing our competitors by a long shot. So I think that's actually been very positive. But we're picking up the cost for it. So that's the one. We have a DRC lease separation that cost that we picked up in Q2 last year. So we'll lap that in this coming second half. And so there's been some changes in that regard, but also things like COVID is now at an end, and the return to office type expenses that we are picking up. So we do see a stronger second half, and that will come, that we will deliver on. But we've had to take some of the costs, especially the startup costs,
right,
in Ethiopia.
Briefly here, for the benefit of our viewers who may not necessarily be familiar with the inner workings of a telecoms company, what goes into launching a new network, especially when we look at the costs that were involved for the Ethiopian side?
Yeah, so when you start up a network, of course, you've got all the expenses, but you've got no revenue flowing. We only launched in October, so to build it out, you of course need people first and foremost. You then have to bring in a lot of network equipment. You've got to build towers, you've got to build sites. And so you need all the costs. You need buildings, you need people, you need vehicles. You of course need equipment. And then you've got to go out and build the network first and foremost. And so initially you're picking up all the costs associated with that, and then the revenue only flows when you launch. The good news is we launched in October, and we've already achieved 740,000 customers in just over a month. So, I think that's hugely positive in terms of the demand that's there for the product.
Speaking of demand for a product, how would you characterize the appetite for your super apps?
It's going really, really well. I mean, we have 3.5 million downloads in South Africa, 2.2 million registered users. And then similarly in the M-Pesa markets, we've already picked up 3.2 million customers, and we've only launched in Tanzania and Kenya at this point. So, still a few more markets to go, but we are seeing good traction coming through, and very, very encouraging.
In your results presentation, you spoke about cost efficiency programs to mitigate against the global macroeconomic environment. What do those cost efficiency programs entail?
So it's a multitude of different things. Of course, trying to optimize our costs from a procurement perspective, looking at, getting better prices, these type of things, but also looking at more aggressive sharing with competition, sharing within the Vodafone stable, and trying to make sure that we can optimize our costs. As an example, we have a networks operational center where we monitor all the networks from South Africa as an example. And that's helped us to reduce the costs of providing the services individually in each country. So these type of services, I think, play a big role, but also just headcount freezes, basically looking at things like discretionary spend, pulling back on some of the spend, and so that we can have a better second half. It's a time for tightening the belt.
Speaking of that second half, what will you and the rest of the team be focusing on? And perhaps you can let us in a little bit more on the financial services activities.
Sure. I think, some of the things that we're focusing on, of course, we announced today that we got the FRA approval in Egypt. So it's now the final legs of, in the coming weeks, getting the transaction over the line and then the integration in that. I think the second one is now working with Competition Commission in terms of the approvals for the fiber deal in South Africa, now that ICASA has approved the transaction. And then, of course, it's the continuous making sure that we run our networks efficiently, that we're gaining more customers, driving out more smartphone penetration, and so on across our markets. That's a key focus area for us. And then, of course, building out rural coverage. We've got special purpose vehicles that we're creating for both rural coverage and fiber, and I think those are important plays. And then, of course, financial services. And in that respect, it's about scaling the financial services even more. We're seeing very good growth, 19% growth in the half coming through in financial services, gaining more customers, getting them to take up more of our services, and making sure that we launch the super apps everywhere, but also that we're growing our investment offerings, payment offerings, lending offerings, and shopping offerings. And I think that's gonna become even more important going ahead.
Shameel, thank you so much for your time this afternoon. That is Shameel Joosub, who is the CEO of Vodacom, unpacking the period that was for the group as they released their interim results.